Guys, welcome to another video. You've got Mr. Everything English, and this is going to be an amazing video because in this video I go over the top 10 quotes from an inspector calls. Let's begin.
Everything education. Tuition for maths, English and science.
Guys, quote number one is a very famous quote. Unsinkable, absolutely unsinkable. And for me, guys, this quote is two fantastic techniques. I want you guys to use a structural technique of foreshadowing, and I want you guys to use the technique of symbolism. And when it comes to context, I want us to keep it real, guys, and I want to apply this quote to capitalism. Now, what are we doing with this particular quote? Unsinkable, absolutely unsinkable. Mr. Burling, he is certain. He is 100% certain. And he emphasizes this with the repetition of the verb unsinkable. What is he talking about here, guys? When it comes to this quote, I don't want us to talk about this quote as him talking about the Titanic. What was the Titanic a symbol of? The Titanic was a symbol of power. It was a symbol of wealth. It's similar to the likes of Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos trying to go to space. The Titanic was a symbol of capitalism. So when Mr. Burling says unsinkable, absolutely unsinkable, yes, he says that the ship will never sink. But more importantly, he says that capitalism will never die. Capitalism will never sink. And this is why this is foreshadowing. Because what is the inspector here to do? The inspector is here to drown capitalism. The inspector is here to sink capitalism. And this is how you want to use this quote. It shows the arrogance. It shows the power. It shows the confidence that Mr. Burling has in the capitalist ideology. But it also shows that just the way the Titanic hit an iceberg and sank, Mr. Burling, capitalism will smack into the inspector and down they will go. Or will they? But this is how you want to analyze this quote. Now, this quote, guys, I've given you the structural devices. I've given you language devices. I've given you context. There's so much we can use. Now, what kind of questions could you use this quote for? You can definitely use it for a question about Mr. Burling. You can use it on a question about the inspector and his purpose. You can use it on a question about class and responsibility. This one quote can be fitted into lots of different questions. Quote number two, guys. Now, this is a lovely one, guys. I really like this quote. And this comes under form because both of these quotes, I've stuck them both here. Both of these are stage directions. Now, ignore my wonky eye, but listen very carefully. I love this quote. Use this quote to get the mark for form, but more importantly, what do we do with this quote? When the inspector first arrives, his doorbell is described as a sharp ring. Now, if something is sharp, it cuts through. It cuts through. From the very beginning, who does the inspector cut with his doorbell? It's Mr. Burling. Mr. Burling is talking and he is silenced. He is cut off by the doorbell of the inspector. Power imbalance is about to begin. Then, every time Mr. Burling talks, Priestley in the stage directions keeps saying, cutting in, cutting in, cutting in. And I use the analogy of a tree and somebody chopping the tree with an axe. Mr. Burling, capitalism is the tree. The inspector, socialism, is the axe. And through the stage directions, chop, chop, chop until the tree eventually falls. This is a very good quote because it's a stage direction and it allows you to get the mark for form effortlessly. Now, how could we use this quote? What could we do with it? What kind of question could we use it for, guys? We can use this quote naturally for Mr. Burling, for the inspector, for socialism, for capitalism, for responsibility, but we can also use this quote to look at family. Eric, Sheila, Mrs. Burling, and so on. Because just the way the tree represents capitalism, you can also say this tree could be a metaphor for their family relationship. And the inspector chops them at their roots and exposes all their disgusting lies and deceits and secrets. Alright guys, that is the second quote that you can use nice and easily. Now, a man has to make his own way, has to look after himself and his family too. We can discuss the imperatives in this quote. Guys, an imperative is a command. We can discuss the rule of three in this quote. This quote, for context guys, you can link it to Freud and the id. And what are we going to be doing with this quote? Guys, a man has to make his own way. Has to. There's not a debate about this. Mr. Burling makes it clear to the other gentlemen, Gerald and Eric, that as a man, you are responsible for yourself. And he almost repeats the first one again. And you have to look after himself. Now, this shows us the dangers of a capitalist belief. Because capitalism, guys, in essence, makes you very individualistic. It makes you very selfish. Because all you care about is yourself. And Mr. Burling openly shows that to the other characters. And then right at the end, like an afterthought, he says, oh, by the way, don't forget your family as well. Because it's as though he remembers that Eric and Gerald are related to him. But do you know how, like you see it quite a lot, right? People's intrusive thoughts. These are Mr. Burling's intrusive thoughts. This is what he truly believes. This is him trying to add it on just to look as though he's quite a nice man. But his true belief, and every other capitalist person's belief, is that as a man, you must prioritize yourself. Now, this quote, guys, the man, the fact that this quote is gendered is very, very important. Mr. Burling makes it clear that the rules for a man and the rules for a woman are very, very different. So, there's rules for rich and poor, but then if you're a rich man, then there's a separate rule set for you. So guys, it really shows how Mr. Burling is fully immersed in his belief, but it shows you how he's become very selfish. He doesn't believe in collective responsibility. He believes in individual responsibility. Now, this quote, how can it be linked to Freud and the id? Freud, remember guys, Freud and the id? Freud spoke about the human brain. He said that our brain has three parts, and one of these parts was the id. The id is our instinct. The id is our desire. So what does Mr. Burling show us here? It shows us that Mr. Burling is an absolute slave to his desire. He's an absolute slave to his id, because he says that the only person he worships, the only thing he worships, and the only thing he believes is worthy of worship is himself. Alright, now that's Mr. Burling for you. But how else could we use this quote? Guys, this quote can be used for every male character, because Eric behaves just like this when he arguably rapes Eva Smith. Gerald behaves just like this when he has an affair with Eva Smith. Mr. Burling behaves just like this. This quote is like an hypothesis of the entire play, because in the entire play, every capitalist man believes that they only need to worry about themselves. That's why Gerald has an affair and doesn't really care about Sheila Burling. That's why Eric sleeps with her and arguably rapes her, because he doesn't really care about anything else. That is why when Mr. Burling finds out that Eric had an affair, he doesn't care about the affair, he cares about him stealing money because it affects him. But this quote really shows you two things. It shows you the capitalist belief, but the dangers that can come from this belief. Guys, this quote can also be linked to class, it can be linked to responsibility, it can be linked to family, to show you why the family unit has failed, because family fails because family is the last thought, not the initial thought. But as you can see, guys, you can use this quote for lots of different questions. Number 4, guys, number 4. Clothes means something quite different to a woman. In this quote, this is a lovely quote to talk about gender, men, women, and their relationships. What is being said in this quote? Here, guys, clothes are a symbol of respect. clothes are a symbol of respect. And the male characters are alluding to the idea that we respect a woman based upon how she is dressed. Which is very, very dangerous, because based upon that analogy, they believed that if a woman wasn't covered up, then she didn't respect herself. Now, because they assume that she doesn't respect herself, they believe that they don't need to respect her either. But this quote, guys, it shows you the savage, the beastly side of a patriarchal society where women are sexualized by men. But they are sexualized by men, but more importantly, it is justified. Because the men were of the mindset that we treat a woman the way she deserves to be treated, and she dictates her respect by the way she is dressed. Guys, this quote also then foreshadows to how all the men treat Eva Smith, Daisy Renton, and so on. But guys, this quote is a lovely quote, and it really harnesses the gender roles. So guys, this quote can be used for gender. It can even be used for class, because stereotypically, the poor working class were the ones that were not dressed in the most appropriate ways, and therefore they were treated in a certain way. It can be used to talk about all the male characters, Eric, Gerald, and Mr. Burling. It can be used to show what the inspector came to fix. The inspector came to fix the injustice caused by a capitalist and a patriarchal society. All these quotes can be used for all those questions. Number 5, guys, this quote, boy oh boy, it's like a Fresh and Fit podcast up in here. And this quote, guys, it's a disgusting quote. It's a quote said by Gerald in Act 2 when describing Eva Smith. And he describes her as young and fresh. Guys, here I want you to talk about zoomorphism. Zoomorphism is when you give a human the features of an animal. So guys, I want you to use zoomorphism here. I also want you to use the foreshadowing in this quote. And I want this quote to strongly be linked to Freud and the id. Okay, now, guys, this quote, Gerald has no shame. Gerald has no shame. Young and fresh alludes to the idea of Eva Smith. But to take it further, he treats her like a piece of meat. He treats her like an animal. She's young and she's fresh. And therefore he can do with her as he wishes. That's the foreshadowing, and that's a zoomorphism. When it comes to Freud and the id, guys, this is a quote where the man displays pure, innate sexual desire for that woman. Doesn't care about her feelings, doesn't care about her emotions, doesn't care about how she is. He literally sees her as an animal. He sees her as a piece of meat that he can do what he wishes to. So this quote is strongly linked to Freud, but it can also be linked to patriarchy, because Gerald Croft is a dangerous man. Why is he a dangerous man? Number 1, he is super rich. That already gives him power. Number 2, he's a man. That already gives him extra level of power. You put rich and masculinity together, then you get a dangerous combination. But guys, this quote, young and fresh, use it if you get a question about women. Use it for a question about gender, masculinity, the dividing class. If you're married, you will realize. I've chopped this quote off. I've taken out the end part of the quote, because the only part of the quote that we need is this part here. When you're married, you'll realize. Guys, I'm going to make a note on this. This quote is an absolute warning. Guys, this quote is an absolute warning. But before we go over into that, let's go over any techniques that are existing in this quote. We can use the quote here, guys, of foreshadowing. We can use the technique of an imperative. And we can link it to context, guys. And for context, we can link it to patriarchy. So, what are we doing with this quote? This quote, guys, is said by Mrs. Burling. And she says this to her daughter, Sheila Burling. And she says to her, when you're married, you realize. The full quote is, you'll realize that men with important work to do, blah, blah, blah. Now, that's too long to remember for our exams. This part is enough. when you're married, you'll realize. Realize what? Everything. You'll realize that men are more powerful. You'll realize that women belong as housewives. You'll realize your role in society. You'll realize what you can and what you can't say. But this quote can be seen as a warning from the mother to the daughter. She's telling her that when you're a married woman, you become an object, and an object is owned, and she is owned by the husband. And therefore, you will realize that the way you think life is supposed to be, it's not going to work, because we have patriarchy, we have capitalism, we have unwritten rules, unwritten laws that we must live and perform by. And this is a lovely quote, guys. Now, this quote, how can we use it? This quote can be used for Mrs. Burling. This quote can be used for Sheila. This quote can be used for the gender roles. This quote can be used to show the power of the men. This quote can be used to show the very society that the inspector came to destroy. But this one quote, guys, can be used in lots of different ways. We are members of one body. Here, guys, we can talk about the metaphor. We can talk about the symbolism of body, and for now we can link it to the context of socialism. So guys, this quote pretty much sums up the socialist viewpoint. Socialists believe that everyone is equal, everyone is together, and essentially we should all support each other. And the inspector, he tells the other characters that, look guys, we are not alone, we are not acting alone, instead we are all members of one body. Now imagine all of society is one body. When your hand hurts, your head hurts. When your leg hurts over here, all your body feels the pain. This is what he is saying. He is saying to the other characters that we are all responsible for each other. You can't just take your arm out and make your arm act by itself. For the arm to move, my shoulder has to move. For my shoulder to move, I don't know what you call this part, but do you get it, guys? Everything is linked. Your body parts can't function by themselves. Everything is linked to everything else. And that is how we should behave as a society. Guys, this quote, it sums up socialism, but it also directly opposes capitalism. This quote can be used for the inspector. This quote can be used to go against to support responsibility. It can be used to talk about the different male characters and how they go against this. Change. The point is, you don't seem to have learnt anything. Sheila Burling, guys, is laying the smackdown on her family in Act 3. She tells them that, listen, you have not changed. You are exactly the way you are. Now, this quote is a lovely quote to show the change in the character. He goes from being mummy's girl, daddy's girl, to being Miss Obedient, to then in Act 3 standing up for herself, speaking back to her parents, airing her views. She does all of this by the end of Act 3. But even though the technique here, guys, is juxtaposition, I also want to throw a spanner in the works, and I want to argue that Sheila Burling almost lives up to the stereotype of a rich girl. And what's the stereotype? They can't think for themselves. Why? Before this, in Act 1, Sheila is daddy's little girl. Does everything her dad wants. By the end of Act 3, she's now the inspector's mouthpiece. She says and does everything the inspector wants. She's replaced one master for the other. So emotional, so young. I argue, guys, that Sheila Burling, you can argue, yes, she's changed her views, correct. But as a character, she doesn't change that much because she just replaces one master for another. An argument you can use should you wish to. The famous last words of Inspector Ghoul: if you don't fix up, you're gonna burn in fire, you're gonna suffer in blood, and you're gonna feel immense pain, you're gonna feel anguish. Now, this quote, guys, Guys, this quote here, we're going to talk about it as a rule of 3. We're going to link it to Freud and the id. And if we want to go there, guys, you can link this quote to World War One, should you wish to. Alright guys, fire, blood and anguish. Of course you have a rule of 3. These are your 3 punishments. And the inspector is telling them that, look guys, I'm telling you fix up. But if you don't want to fix up, if you want to carry on in your crazy, silly, selfish, individualistic ways, you do your thing. But you may get away with it in this world, but punishment is on its way. And punishment can come in 2 ways. Number 1, this quote could be referring to World War One and the downfall of society. Or number 2, it could be referring to hellfire and the religious punishment that you may suffer later. So guys, we've got rule of 3 and we've got World War One. And then if you want to, you can link it to Freud. I don't know why I did that little dance, but here's ways. Guys, you can link it to Freud and you can say that this quote shows us the dangers of following your desires. Actions have consequences. Nobody is free. Stop doing what you want, because eventually you will have to suffer for the sins that you have committed. Guys, this quote can be applied to all the characters to show the consequences of actions. It can be linked to the importance of responsibility and so on. Alright guys, the last quote. Now, I was debating, guys, which quotes we can use. There's so many quotes. There's quotes about Sheila Burling and the Ring. There's Eric Burling quote. There's so many quotes that I was debating. But again, I wanted to give you what I believe are the 10 quotes that fit almost every single GCSE question. Girls of that class. Very, very judgmental quote. Very harsh quote by Mrs. Burling. It's quite sad, isn't it, that this quote is said by another female character. But it shows you how the tentacles of patriarchy and the tentacles of capitalism run deep. They've really penetrated her. They really run deep in her character. And you want to use this quote, guys, girls of that class, to show, do you know how earlier I said how the men were justifying their actions? In this quote, the women are justifying their actions. Mrs. Burling is saying that girls of that class, meaning girls who are poor, will almost naturally be treated in a certain way. Girls who are poor will almost naturally suffer disrespect. Girls who are poor will almost naturally suffer the things that Eva Smith went through. But this quote, guys, can show you the absolute breaking of society. Care, respect, love, humanity wasn't based upon human beings. It was based upon what gender are you and how big is your bank balance. And all these ideas come across through an inspector calls. And you want to use that in your answer. Now guys, this quote naturally fits Mrs. Burling. This quote fits a question on class, a question on gender, a question on responsibility. It can be used on a question about masculinity, because it justifies the actions of the men. Alright guys, now what I've given you are 10 quotes that I think are 10 very good quotes for an inspector calls. My advice would be the following, guys. As I always say, learn these quotes firstly. Learn these quotes off by heart. Pull up lots of past papers on inspector calls and try to apply them to lots of different questions. Now for your exams, you're aiming for 4 paragraphs. So on the day of your exam, out of the 10, you only need to know 4 that you're going to use on the day. So out of the 10, I argue that all of them can somehow fit the different questions. See how you get on. If you want to add some more quotes, add them. If you want to replace these with others, do so. I do hope, guys, that you find this video beneficial. It's been Mr. Everything English.
Everything Education. Tuition for maths, English and science.